macroeconomics. And then we have Karl Widerquist, who's an American political philosopher and economist at Georgetown, not Washington, but Qatar. Interesting. And then we have Becca, Kirkpatrick, who's she's been working a lot on the basic income in Britain and also closely linked to the unions in Britain, as I understand. So I will give each and every one of the four speakers 5 to 7 minutes each, just to sort of delve into their perspective, and then we'll have a chat amongst ourselves and open up for questions and interventions from you. So Paul, could you share with us some of your some of your experiences from being undercover?
Yeah, sure. So for those of you who haven't read the book already, I went in 2016. I travelled around the United Kingdom, working in a series of low-paid jobs. I didn't set out to target any particular sector. It was a question of trying to get a geographical spread of the country and work in a range of kind of low-paid jobs. So I ended up in a warehouse. I ended up doing care work. I was an Uber driver, and I worked in a call centre and then on a labouring building site. The warehouse was an Amazon warehouse, where I suppose in some ways automation is the question of automation hangs over perhaps both Uber and Amazon more than some of the other areas, at least in the near future. So, I mean, the job I did at Amazon was very routine. So it involved walking around a huge warehouse with a kind of automated device and following the algorithm on the device, picking off items off the shelves for 10.5 hours a day, put them onto conveyor belts, which then go off the final leg to Amazon's customers. And I suppose to kind of touch on automation with regards to this specific job. One of the things, automation comes up every talk I do about the book. So whenever I'm going around, someone will ask a question about automation, usually more than one person. But the discussion around it is interesting in itself because it becomes like a kind of futurology. So people use automation. It comes up predominantly from people who don't really want to do anything about the working conditions in the Amazon warehouse today. So people will say, oh, well, why does it matter? These jobs are going to be automated anyway. People should think themselves lucky that they have a job where, even though you're being kind of disciplined and laid off for things like taking too long in the toilet, for taking days off sick, it's kind of diminished the appetite among some people to actually deal with those things because there's this kind of fatalistic attitude that those jobs are going to disappear anyway. What's the point of even bothering to improve conditions there? People should simply be grateful that they have a job in the first place. That's quite, I wouldn't say it's the dominant narrative around automation in these jobs, but it's quite an influential one. I've heard this from politicians as well, from two Conservative MPs who said this. Is this really what the priority should be, improving working conditions in these places when those jobs are going to disappear anyway? The other kind of point about automation, I guess, is it's already here. It was already there in the Amazon warehouse to some extent, in that you're entirely, you have no autonomy. So you're following the diktats of this algorithm, and you have no autonomy over what you're doing anyway. It's go here, pick this item off the shelf, then go here, do this. And the only time you have any real interaction with a human being is someone, like a supervisor, will send you a kind of admonishment over this algorithm. So a text message will come through on it occasionally, telling you that your production, you're missing the production targets or something. Or, I mean, the most positive thing is, there's overtime available at the end of the shift if you want it. Amazon also patented these devices that the workers would have to wear on their arms, where they haven't deployed this yet, but they patented it where you get like shocks sent through to your arms. So you wear these things on your wrist, and when you're picking the items off the shelves, which is what we had to do, or packing them, if you put your hand in the wrong place, like a shock would be sent through to your arm to kind of cajole you into picking the right item. It's not new though. That comes from, that's like a form of Taylorism. It comes from the principles of scientific management, where you break down like the working day, every working action even, into this perfect scientific formula to maximise productivity. So even putting your hand in the wrong place by, adding a few milliseconds onto the action is considered kind of detrimental to productivity. They're doing that already. They apply the same principles in terms of like toilet breaks. So any kind of toilet break at Amazon was classed as idle time, which is damaging to productivity, which therefore is frowned upon, and disciplinaries are given out for toilet breaks. Never mind that as a human being you obviously need to use the toilet at some point. It goes against the ideology of scientific management, so they didn't care. So the other kind of the final point before I kind of move on is that
could I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
Do you get a shock, electric shock, if you go to the toilet?
Not now, no. You what happens at the moment is, so you have this device you have to have with you at all times. When you arrive in the warehouse, you have to log into this, and it tells you where to go. And say you need to use the toilet, there's no way to log out of the system to say, press a button to take a toilet break. So when you stop scanning things, they pick that up on a central computer. Why have you stopped scanning things? And you have to go through security to use the toilet anyway, like in an airport style. Take your belt off, take your watch off, empty your pocket delay, go through your wallet, which takes obviously 5-10 minutes in itself. And then that should have come on at the end.
Yeah. So they don't give you a shock if you don't wash hands?
No. So I mean, the act of going to taking the toilet break itself takes 5 to 10 minutes. You're in a warehouse the size of 10 football pitches, which is... I use this expression because they use this all the time. They would boast about the warehouse being the size of 10 football pitches, like a kind of phallic boast or some weird thing they were so impressed by. But so it takes those 2 toilets in the whole building, so it takes, say, 10 minutes to get a toilet, and they just see this class, this is idle time, as they would call it. You're idling. Why are you idling? At the end or the beginning of every shift, they would pick people out and say, you have this much idle time over this day or this shift. Why is this idle time? And saying I was going to the toilet wasn't a sufficient explanation to explain it, even if it was just 5 minutes. And so the logical consequence of that was you would then find, I found a bottle of urine in the warehouse where someone had done that because they were afraid perhaps they were one disciplinary point away from losing their job, so they'd done this. The GMB union had found excrement at the back by the dustbins, urine as well. They found similar things. That's a logical consequence when you're afraid to go to the toilet. And just the final kind of point I wanted to make is automation. I was in areas of the country which were hit by deindustrialisation in the 1980s. So South Wales, the West Midlands. I was in the northwest as well. I mean, the northeast has perhaps been harder hit, but the northwest as well. And it's those areas which they still fail to recover from the last disruption, as the tech people call it, with the industrial jobs going. And the skills training is poor there. There's kind of that cliff edge where if you don't go to university, lots of people there haven't gone to university. And there's that cliff edge now where if you don't go to university, it's very hard to get a professional job. Everything's become professionalised. So if you don't go to university, you're likely to be stuck in one of these low-paid jobs. And those are the jobs that are most likely to go, first of all, from automation. So there are obviously, first of all, great lessons in Europe, America, Britain from the last great disruption, deindustrialisation, like how not to do it, how not to make that transition from an industrial economy to a service economy. Because South Wales, even today, you have 1 in 6 people in parts of South Wales on antidepressants, which is not because they're simply there's greater predisposition for depression in that area. It's simply because there was a long period of the lack of work, and a lack of work typically has a big impact on mental health. But those areas are also likely to be hit hardest by the next wave of automation because there are concentrations of low-skilled jobs there which are easier to automate.
Lovely, thank you very much, James. Karl.
Well, I think that the automation issue in UBI is something that we've been talking about very much in the wrong way. It's gained a lot of attention to the basic income movement, which is great, but I think it could cause some problems for it. I'm not saying. So I want to talk about this a right way and a wrong way to talk about automation. People have been talking about it in the sense that someday robots are going to replace all labor, at least all working class labor. And then there's going to be this massive unemployment, and then we're going to have basic income to survive. And even though it's a realistic possibility, it's true. It's never happened before, and that's not proof that it will never happen. It had never happened to the horse by the beginning of the 20th century, and then it happened to the horse. It could happen to human labor, so it could happen. But there are a lot of reasons which I think this is not really the right way to be talking about basic income. One, it's hard to get people to believe it, even though it is a realistic possibility. It's one that seems fanciful and far out. It's hard to get people to believe it. And then also, but it comes with an automatic wait and see. If you say this is why because someday robots are going to replace all labor, even though we have more people working now than ever before. If you say someday, then they say, okay, well, we'll wait for someday. It seems that there might be urgency about this problem someday, but there's no urgency about it now. There's great urgency for UBI right now, not someday. And even if it is happening, if it does happen, a day when it actually replaces all working class labor might be farther off than people think. As a matter of fact, people were talking about this problem in the 1960s. It's one of the things that brought off the wave of support that the guaranteed income had at that time. There was a lot of people talking about robots and computers replacing labor, and we were a long way then from it happening, from it really replacing all labor. So we might be longer than we think right now. We don't know. Another reason why I think it's the wrong way to talk about it. And so if it doesn't happen as fast as people like predicting automation, and then 10 years from now, it hasn't significantly happened, people might get sick and say, oh, you guys have been saying that forever, and it just keeps not happening. Well, there are other things that are happening that are related to automation that we should be talking about. Another thing is that automation, I don't believe, looks like what we think automation will look like. We think you get automation, replaces labor, then you're going to have higher unemployment, then more automation, then more unemployment. We think it's going to be increasing unemployment. But that is not necessarily how it's going to work, or it is working, or it has been working. There is a time in history, actually, when that sets a precedent for this. There's a time in history when capital could do everything that working class labor could do. You know what that period was called? It was called the slavery period. So if you look in the American South during the slavery period, when there was a form of capital called African slavery that could do everything that free labor could, you did not have higher unemployment in the South than you did in the North. What you got was greater inequality. You got Southern working class whites having to work for wages that made them materially not much better off than the Africans were as far as what they were fed and how they were housed. They were, of course, in terms of free movement, they were much better off. And in terms of being higher in the pecking order and being able to look down on somebody, they were far better off than the African slaves. But they weren't paid that much more. So it came out when capital could directly compete with working class labor, it came out in inequality, not in ever rising unemployment. And it ignores, by focusing on this someday replacement, we're ignoring all the automation-related reasons that we need basic income now, and we needed it for a long time. So that's why I want to get to the right way, I think, to talk about automation, is that whatever happens with an ultimately automation replacing labor is that it disrupts the labor market. Is that you do what you're supposed to do. You learn a trade. You go out there and get a job in your field, and something you can't predict, your skills are not needed anymore. Your job has been replaced. It's happened to coal miners. It's happened to textile workers. It's happening now perhaps to professional drivers and the people who work in the support industry for professional drivers. It happens and it creates this disruption that even if ultimately there are more jobs are created, or as many jobs as created are destroyed, this disruption never goes away. This disruption hurts people's lives, and for the rest of their life. Is that usually what happens is that the new jobs go to the young, and not to those who are 50 years old, whose job has been replaced by new technology. Often these people are forced to go into the lowest skilled sector of the labor market, and they sit there until retirement. And that's what we have been doing with the working class, with different waves of automation going back for several hundred years. That is the prime automation reason to have a basic income, to protect people from these unexpected disruptions to the labor market that automation has continuously been doing for hundreds of years. And this is also closely related to another important reason, is that over the last 50 years, as we've been dismantling the welfare system, over the last 50 years, we've had great automation and great economic growth since then. And the benefits of that growth have gone almost entirely to the top 1%, to the owners of the capital from which the machines are made, and to their top level of managers and executives. The rest of us have not shared. The teacher, the taxi driver, the typical office worker are not getting paid much more now than they were in the 1970s. If more. Some of them in some sectors of the economy are making less. Automation has made it possible over those last 50 years for all of us to work less and earn more. And most of us are working more and earning about the same. We need basic income to give us the leverage to command our share of the automation that's happened over the last half century. So automation means that, in fact, we're due for basic income. In fact, we're overdue. We need it to protect normal people from the disruptions of the labor market caused by automation. We need it to give normal people the leverage to get their share of the automation benefits that we've had over these years. And in fact, we've needed it at least since the Luddite movement of the 1820s. People think, though, they look back and they think those Luddites were idiots who didn't see that technology is good. Technology is good. It wasn't good for the textile workers whose jobs were being replaced and who never got a better job in their life. Maybe their children did. Maybe actually it took until their grandchildren did. And their grandchildren in the late Victorian age, before they started to catch up with where the textile makers were before they started losing their jobs to automation. We needed it since then. We need to talk about these here and now automation-related reasons to have a UBI.
So what you're saying is that robots, those are our new slaves, and we have to use them wisely, and we have to have a fair share of what that wealth which has been created before, a fair share of them.
Well,
via the form of a basic income, for instance. Okay, we'll come back to that. Okay, Paul, what's your take on this?
Well, I thought I was going to have a different take to the others, but in fact, it seems I've got a pretty similar take to Karl. So I wouldn't claim to be an expert on automation. I'm from World Basic Income. Our focus is on poorer countries of the world in general, and raising basic income from the commons and from what we call a rigged economic system. But let's go back to 1972, when I was an 11-year-old in primary school. Don't do the calculation. I was in a geography lesson, and our geography teacher, this was in Salford in the UK, our geography teacher said, "You guys are the lucky generation. When you grow up, your problem is going to be what to do with your leisure time." Look at the advances in technology that are going on in Japan, Hong Kong, well, mostly Asian in those days. So what are you going to do with your leisure time? And I thought, wow, this sounds good. And he was right, and he was wrong. Because exactly as Karl said, I mean, I've actually got a presentation here, I can't show it, but there's a very famous diagram that economists know well. And if you Googled wages decoupled from productivity, you'd find it. And you'd get the example of a diagram from 6 different countries, the USA, Australia, Japan, UK, Canada, and Germany. I've always been familiar with the UK. And in 1972, what you got, ever since the Second World War, was productivity rising and rising and rising. And basically because we had a different type of economics, which some people call Keynesianism, and social democracy, the share of wages would keep track with productivity. Until in the USA, about 1970, when you got Nixon shocks, consolidated in 1980 when Reagan came into power. And in the UK, you can see it from about 1979, 1980. The historians amongst you might remember Thatcher came into power in 1979. And what you've got ever since those years, and it's been replicated in many countries around the world, what you got was productivity still rising, but wages, as Karl said, your teachers, your lorry drivers, whoever, wages flatlining, basically. And in fact, over the last few years, there's been a little bit of decline there. And the exception on this diagram was Canada. And the reason that Canada didn't decouple quite so much as the other countries is that their labour unions were actually much stronger. It's no coincidence that Thatcher targeted the labour unions in the UK, smashed them. So then you can't bargain to get a fair share of the increase in productivity. And it's in that context that I put automation. Automation could actually make your productivity go even higher. But as long as we've got this system that's rigged, our wages are going to flatline if we're lucky enough to get employment. So it's not, to me, automation is not the problem. It's why did those wages flatline? And some of you yesterday will have heard Guy talking about the 4 A's. And I actually used the B word. The causes of the problem are the billionaires. And why did wages flatline? Yeah, you can relate it to neoliberalism, but why did neoliberalism enter the fray, as it were? It was seriously financed by some very, very rich people who financed philanthropically many institutes, foundations, etc., largely in the United States. Though right now we're finding Tufton Street area in London full of all of this dark money as well. So that's where I put automation, is in the context of a rigged system. It could be used for our benefit, but as long as this system persists, it won't be. And many of us will be thrown on the scrap heap, unemployed. They're even talking about lawyers now. So I suppose that's generally my view. And I'd recommend you Google it, wages decoupled from productivity. I think it's the most powerful graph that I know of explaining what's happened since the Second World War. Okay? Just to finish, because I think it's often overlooked, as I said at the beginning, world basic income, a large part of our focus is with poorer countries of the world. And what I've seen in many of these automation arguments is a kind of defensive what's going to happen to our jobs in Western countries. And often it's forgotten that, in fact, the impact on poorer countries could be just as bad, if not worse. And if you think about it, many of the most routine tasks have been offshored to India, China, Indonesia, Thailand, wherever. And it's the routine tasks that can be automated first. Okay? And I'm going back to 2016, 3 years ago, this World Bank research. The share of occupations that could experience significant automation is actually higher in developing countries than in more advanced ones, where many of these jobs have already disappeared, and this concerns about 2/3 of all jobs. So I'm just putting a plea out there. When we're thinking about automation, don't just think about our Western democracies. Remember the rest of the world. Thanks.
Okay, Becca, read systems as Paul.
Yeah, so very cool, because actually your contribution there really tightly segues on to exactly what I was going to start with. So, I was going to start with a point now because, as correctly pointed out, in most cases, with notable few exceptions, our unions are weak now. It's still, at this point, human labour is cheaper than automation. And so it does capture a lot of very exciting headlines, but I think you'll find it will get talked about in more of the concept of automation can get raised as a kind of having a disciplining effect on workers. They can feel insecure, less willing to actually try and organise because they feel they'll be replaced. One example I could give you is in the UK, one of our most still strong unions where they do come out and good wages would be the RMT in the transport section. And there's some conversations going on right now about the tube, the underground train in London, whether that's going to be automated, and then racing to develop these trains. And quite clearly, if that was to happen and organised labour on our tube system was to be smashed as well, that would be one of our very last remaining bastions of strong union power, which, as Paul has explained, we can see what then results from that. But, like Paul, I'm also not an expert on automation. My main take on it is in terms of actually, I guess, thinking about the body, how it could be used in our favour. So, my husband doesn't have any formal qualifications, and for his whole working life he's done various forms of very hard labour, whether it's markets, roofing, building work. Most recently he's worked as a tarmacker. And he's middle-aged now, and when you get into your 50s, you do not want to be still labouring like a young person. It really takes its toll on all your joints, not to mention the mind. And my personal most encapsulating image of capitalism is actually night after night rubbing my husband's back until my own arms ache and feeling very, very angry about that. Very angry. Just night after night. That's to me the system that we have. And when me and my husband saw on YouTube a video of a machine laying down a road surface, we both cheered. Bring it on, please, come on. We don't need to be breaking our backs into our middle and old age now. At this point in history, we have the science, we have the technology. Was it William Gibson, the sci-fi writer, said, the future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed. There's a lot of work that people don't need to be doing, and they're still being forced to do it. You work your back with your fingers to the bone, or you starve, because that's cheaper than actually investing our technology and prioritising people's well-being and organising society differently. So I wanted to share that anecdote. I actually wrote a little piece about this. I don't know if you guys seen the film Sliding Doors with Gwyneth Paltrow, or maybe Run Low Run, the German film. So that basically I was showing a day in the life, two different, without basic income and with a basic income, and it talks about automating tarmacking and how we could break down care work into much smaller chunks and people could see it as an appealing thing to do with part of their time. So if you wanted to read that, if you Google Compass, which is a UK organisation, their website, and the article is called A Day in the Life, and my name, and you should find that. So other than that, the only other things I wanted to chuck in was a couple more anecdotes from the two organisers who I spoke to, who have been either working with unions that are organising at Amazon or with kind of platform economy workforces as well. And just to emphasise that there's still very much need for the old school face-to-face slow human approach to workers building their power even in these new sectors. So Nigel Flanagan from the Amazon Alliance told me that some kind of whiz kid had come up with this app for workers to try and track their footfall to use for bargaining purposes in warehouses, but then, as James has already explained, with the security of these places, you can't even have your phone with you, so that was completely redundant. Eventually, I'm sure a lot of bright sparks put a lot of energy into that, but it wasn't actually what's going to help in that context. And Kulsoom Jaffrey from United Private Hire Drivers told me a couple of interesting things that might not be so, what's the word, like an instinctive view that you might have about what it's like to organise in the precarious sector. So she raised the point that actually working in the precarious sector in some ways could give you more time to organise. It's kind of a flip side to the downfall of not knowing how many hours you're going to be working. You will have some idle time, and that can actually help be creatively put into union organising. She also said, she made the point that if you work in an office for a couple of decades and you see everyone day in and day out and you see the same manager day in day out, it can get quite personal. And even though you're more secure, it can make people feel more reluctant to organise there. And so what she's found with working with Uber drivers, delivery and other couriers is because these new companies that are so keen to make the point, oh, we're just an app, we're just an app, we're nothing more than that. They're faceless. It's very clear. It's like you can actually struggle quite hard against a faceless logo because it's not a real person, So she found psychologically people were very up for having a good fight against these companies as a result of the way they're positioning themselves. So last thing I would recommend to you is a great book by a guy called Bob Hughes. It's called The Bleeding Edge, and it's a fascinating book. Looks at like the history of technology. Pretty much every single page of the book, there's a fact that will make you go, wow, did not know that. Just really stuffed with amazing information. And one of the takeaways from that book is how much the drive towards making things smaller and faster is really, really market driven. It's not about it being better or more efficient or better for us. It's always about market and profit ultimately. And sometimes that leads to some really illogical developments in technology. So I strongly recommend you read that book. I think urgently for the well-being of humanity, we should be having a conversation about what work can we automate right now, how we share around more equitably the remaining work that we do still need and want to do, what work are we not doing yet that we need to be doing. We've got to be having this conversation, but as Paul has really well laid out, it's a question of power. We working people are in a weak position of power. We're poorly organised, and so any developments in automation are fully out of our hands at this point. And that's why I've chosen to dedicate my activist time to trying to work in unions for whatever remains of the unions or whatever that's worth, because I believe that it's absolutely essential to try and change the balance in some way back the other way so we can get some control over the direction that we're headed.
So James, your book is more about the exploitative parts of working life, prison. Did you ever think about basic income as one way of getting out of this cul-de-sac?
I guess basic income comes in. So I mentioned yesterday during a talk, over the last kind of, say 20 years roughly, maybe a bit longer, as work has become more, Guy doesn't like me using the word precarious, but as work has become more insecure, so there are fewer guarantees over the number of hours you're getting each week, for example. The political kind of narrative has moved away from universalism towards this idea that social security should be something that's given on a contributory basis. So it's become a lot more piecemeal. So there's been this tendency of both New Labour and Conservative politicians to say that, you know, if we look at the moment, like a work fair, that kind of thing, where, or in the United States under Clinton, there were the reforms where, you know, welfare to work, where you have to show, I mean, you have to, at the moment in Britain, you have to show that you're looking for work 35 hours a week in order to get a basic job seeker's allowance. There are more holes with which you can fall through the welfare system at a time where you actually need a much more universal welfare system, because you're much more likely to go in and out of jobs through no choice of your own. You know, you get a job, then suddenly your hours, you're not getting enough hours, and then at the moment, if you're on a 0 hours contract, you may have, say, 35 hours one week, and then the following week you may just have 5 hours. Yet companies some of the companies I work for basically prevent you getting another job. It says in the contract you cannot get another job without, you know, the express permission of the company. You also can't sign on to job seekers allowance because you officially have a class as having a job. So something like UBI would be hugely beneficial in that situation, because it would provide that, on the one hand it would provide you with the power to say no, it would give you more power to say no, to refuse to take something that you felt was beneath your dignity, which I think is an absolutely valid reason for refusing to accept a job. I mean, there's this narrative in Britain at the moment where, because lots of the jobs that I did are done by Eastern European migrants, because there's simply that, on their part, there's that greater economic need. If you're coming from Romania, you earn, say, maybe 2 or 3 times as much in an Amazon warehouse, even as you do in your job back at home. And so, what people sometimes say is, they try to sound progressive, and they say, well, you know, these Romanians are brilliant because they're doing this work because British people are just kind of too coddled and lazy. They don't want to do this work anymore. I think it's actually not refusing to do a job where you're being given disciplinaries for taking a toilet break or being given disciplinaries for taking a day off sick. We should encourage the Romanians to be like that as well, to have some kind of, to demand that their kind of dignity and whatnot is respected. And I think something like UBI would give someone greater leverage to say no and to refuse to take on that kind of work and refuse to be exploited in that way. It's nothing to celebrate that some people are desperate enough to be exploited like that. And I think UBI would create a modest floor, a modest income floor, so you have that kind of power to say no.
Of course, with Brexit, you might not have any Romanians left in the country.
No,
that's a different topic, I suppose.
Foreigners out.
The taxation question on automation and robots, I mean, different political parties have different takes on that. Should there be a specific taxation regime on automation in order to redistribute
No, that's absolutely the worst way to go about it, is to tax the robot. If you tax something if you want people to do less of it. If you want people to smoke less, you raise the taxes on smoking, and over the course of decades it has some effect. Why on earth we want to discourage the building of robots that can take over the most unpleasant jobs? It's just the absolute wrong way to go about it. What you want to do is to tax the people who own the resources. Well, tax the resources that we make these machines out of. Tax the capital and the land and the financial institutions.
So this is
behind
more in
those, and then let them find their most efficient use. If you take it, we're gonna tax you for using your things most efficiently. What you're doing is then essentially subsidizing them for using their capital inefficiently. So you you capitalists can make more money if you use your capital inefficiently.
So this is more like Thomas Piketty than taxing the actual wealth base of people,
Yes.
the inheritance, etc. Because the Green Party in Norway has actually proposed taxing robots, if you like.
Yeah, I think that's a horrible idea.
Okay, I'll tell them. Any other take on that? Because I mean, this is a question which is going to come up in the political debates.
I'm with Karl.
Again.
I was going to say, it does become a question of kind of broader ownership of the companies in a way. If you have, so I use the example of Amazon just because I've researched it a lot, but if you have a company like Amazon which is no longer bringing jobs to a place, is no longer really paying much tax, it becomes a question of kind of, it's providing a certain level of like managerial jobs. It's being subsidised by the local authorities. So Amazon's been heavily subsidised by some of the poorest local authorities in Britain. Then it becomes a question of who owns the machines then, which then becomes, you know, we go back to old debates around nationalisation and stuff. To me, it kind of, you can't just talk about, you know, taxing robots as has been said. That seems like a piecemeal and counterproductive response. You have to then look at ownership of the companies eventually.
You agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, theoretically, just for me, it just comes back to a panel question of what it would take to see that happen.
Okay. Questions, comments? Yes. Tell us your name, please.
Guy Standing. I'd like to make a couple of comments. First, I made this subject a key one for my book on corruption and capitalism. And what Paul was talking about is usually called the jaws of the snake. Okay? and the interesting thing is that I discovered there are 5 jaws of snakes. You see, it's not just between product. The idea is that with the idea of snake is that when it opens its jaws, the upper jaw goes up and the lower jaw goes down. That's the idea. Well, it used to be that when productivity went up, wages went up in unison. But the interesting thing is that the jaws have opened, right? Well, the interesting thing is that's not the only pair of jaws that have been opening. It used to be the case when employment went up, wages went up, average wages. But now in a lot of countries, that's the other way, it's the jaws of the snake. It used to be the case when profits went up, wages went up. Ditto, jaws of snake. Labour cost, yeah.
There's the diagram.
Yeah,
See it from across the room.
yeah.
That's roughly when Paul was still 11 years old.
Nixon shot.
And I was 7.
But Karl,
All right.
What is it, 1932?
the interesting thing is that in some countries, that diagram that you've just shown have been more like jaws of snakes.
Yeah.
Because the lower part has fallen, not just risen more slowly. So, and this goes on with profits, with employment, and ironically in some countries, tax revenue from employment. It used to be when employment went up, tax revenue from employment went up as well. Now, it's often the other way round. Poor old George Osborne started losing public revenue because employment was rising and the tax revenue was declining. Okay. Now, the interesting thing about this is that it happens in countries with stronger unions and with weak unions. So the simplistic suggestion that this is due to the declining bargaining power of labour doesn't stand up to scrutiny, right? No, it doesn't stand up to scrutiny. It is a factor. It is a factor, of course. But as I looked into it, I realized the bigger factor is the change of the intellectual property rights system. Okay? The period of this taking place coincides with the World Intellectual Property Organization passing TRIPS. Okay? And TRIPS has given far higher percentage of the income from patents and copyright and the ownership of technology to the rentiers. That's the big rigging that's taken place. Plus, governments are giving more and more subsidies to the owners of technologies. Right? So it's a systemic thing. And you can't say that responsibility for the system is due to the winners from the system. Okay, which is a tendency for blaming the plutocrats. The plutocrats are the outcome of the systemic change that's been taking place. They've been accelerating the outcome, but the fact is the rentiers got into power as a result of the emergence of financial capital under the Reagan-Thatcher era. All right? So I think the story is much more nuanced and more interesting for us, because in the end, what we've got is a system where more and more of the income is going to the rentiers. And that is the superstar firms, which are in the technology, have got an oligopoly where they dominate. So they have become the key suckers of rent. So we have a challenge. How do we get the rent redistributed as basic income for a new distribution system? So I think single dimension things in this debate lose us the political argument. Right? It's I 100% agree with Becca that union weakness is a factor, but it's only one of the factors.
Any comments on that?
I'd largely go along with that, but I'd like to just take that one step further. And what we've heard this weekend is often that we have difficulty in convincing unionists as to why basic income is a good idea. And I think it's the jaws of the snake, that diagram. Often, when you show that to them, it's interesting to say, look, we're fighting the same battle. You're fighting the battle to take back the surplus from the rentiers. Basic income is fighting exactly that same battle as well. And why not fight it on two fronts? And I take the point that it's much more nuanced than just the unions. We've seen, how shall I put it, in Britain we call them right-wing unions, I suppose, but less effective unions. And so the union movement has been quite dissipated. The States the same. So yeah, I wouldn't put it all on the unions, but definitely what Guy said with regards to intellectual property is a serious problem. When we're talking about market capitalisation, out of the top 10 firms in the world, 5 of them are these, 4 of them are basically using the data that we've created, and a large part of their wealth is as a result of the data we've created: Facebook, Amazon, Apple, and Alphabet, Google. Okay, and that is the question: how do we get that back?
Yes, please.
So, there's been an argument advanced by a couple of people that we're not losing jobs as a result of automation. I guess, I see that as very much a rich country perspective, because if you look at employment worldwide, unemployment in a lot of global south countries is absolutely through the roof. Some places you have 75% unemployment, for instance, and it's really, when you start thinking about it in a global perspective, it's really easy to see how that happens, because so farming traditionally has been a huge employer of people. Also, small manufacture, people will be a potter making pots, or a carpenter, so on. So think about industrial farming around the world now. What that does is produce grain, for instance, at a much lower cost than people in local communities in poor countries are able to do. It floods those markets, or it depresses the market price, completely puts those farmers out of business, massively reduces unemployment. Not because the automation has happened there, not because someone showed up at the local farm with a tractor and made those workers unemployed, but through the effects of a global market system. The same happens if you're a potter working in a small country, in a not very well-off country, and then somebody starts importing plastic buckets made in a factory in China. The entire basis of your market has fallen through, despite the fact that no one set up a factory nearby and actually taken your job away. So I think automation, it seems to me obvious that automation has an enormous employment effect, but predominantly on people in developing countries. Whereas people in richer countries with high levels of education, we're able to move into being the ones that sit there endlessly typing legal notes about intellectual property of the plastic buckets or the tractors, or those kind of jobs end up with us and don't end up with people in other countries. So I'd like to know if the panel agree with my analysis, and if so, what you think that means for basic income. So I know what Paul will think. We're in the same organisation. Well, basic income.
So you disqualified then, okay?
And we believe that for this reason and many others, there should, as well as national basic income, must be a worldwide basic income. And this automation argument is one of those reasons, because the effects are felt overseas. So I wonder what everybody else thought.
Can I just add something quickly?
Please.
There's a very interesting book I read recently called The Globotics Revolution. It's a new book, but that talks about how automation is the next wave is also threatening middle class jobs in the West, because in the developing world, say a country like China or India, technology now facilitates jobs which traditionally, like clerical jobs, say, which have traditionally been done by lower middle class professionals in the West. You can now university graduates in China or India can now do those jobs for what's equivalent of the minimum wage in Britain. They can do those jobs simply because technology allows them to do that. So for example, friends of mine run companies where they now outsource translation services, they now outsource things like this to people who bid on this website. I forgot what it's called, it's quite a well-known website. People bid to do the job for you. And it's typically graduates the emerging middle class in countries like China or India who do that. And also things like, this book even said, that jobs like jobs in lawyers' offices can go to these countries now, because you can have conferences with people in various parts of the world. You do not need to be in the same office or anything. I work remotely, for example, as a writer. You don't need to be in any specific place. I did it for America for a while, writing about British politics. It makes no difference whatsoever. So there is some of those middle class jobs are also going to those countries from. Because technology facilitates that, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is for if your middle class job in the West is going to those countries, it creates a political backlash anyway.
Interesting issue raised, but as far as I understand, 70% of the world produce, if you like, of food is produced by small-scale agriculturists, peasants, basically. Only 30% is shipped, across the borders. And in that sense, the basic occupation in the south is still a small-scale peasants.
Yeah,
that does mean it's in danger from this kind of automation.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean they're getting a fair price.
Well, I'm sure a lot of that is not being sold. A lot of that is consumed in the village where it's produced. But I have to admit, ignorance on your question. I do not know what the cause is of such high unemployment across the developing world. As Guy said about what's happening in the modern world, I'm sure it's very nuanced and there's a lot of causes. I know that in South Africa there's been very high unemployment for a lot of decades, and I doubt you're going to go back in history and find a point where all of those people in South Africa had jobs and then they were automated away. Now, automation could be making it harder for them to get new jobs, and that's going to have an effect. But no, I have to admit ignorance. My argument is not based on having based on the idea that automation cannot cause higher unemployment. It certainly can, but is that we shouldn't be relying on that. If you say, basic, 10 years from now, people saying, oh, basic income, you're the people who were telling me in 2012 that I was going to lose my job by 2020. Here it is, 2029, I still got my job. And you guys are still around? You're like, you show your face around here? But I'm sure by 2029, it's still kidding. We don't have some serious policies to address it. Automation and other factors are going to be causing great inequality and disruptions in labor markets, and that's the stuff that we've got to base our campaign on.
Gentleman down there, yes, please.
Karl, when you say disruption of labor market, do you mean you're referring to the quality of jobs? Because in terms of the numbers, maybe jobs are there. Even yesterday, Guy was saying that the unemployment is not as much as we imagine. So, but the new employment that has been growing in the last 2 decades or even 2.5 decades has been of a very low quality, flexible, and what we call precariat. So, even as the numbers are not, the numbers will never show that, because there's a lot of underemployment and also informal contracts and no contracts and all that. So when you say, what do you mean by the disruption of labor market? Are you referring to that aspect or something else?
Oh, no, it is, actually, there's a lot of, like, lower level jobs where you have to commit to some skills to doing this job. You could be, you know, say you've been a manager at McDonald's for the last 10 years, that is a crappy job. If that gets automated, though you've got 10 years of experience in this field, that's not necessarily going to be good for you to go into the tech sector. You know, so it disrupts all kinds of jobs. You know, meat packers, one of the worst jobs in the United States, now that they busted the unions. Meat packers could be automated away, and that's, they should be relieved, but they're going to have a hard time finding, well, what else can I do?
Yeah, I want to come back to a point I made yesterday, but I don't want to repeat it. I think the effect of the technological changes on the technical and social division of labour has to be taken into account and given much greater attention. Without a doubt, in my mind, the development of electronic technologies has accelerated the growth of the precariat and has created the class fragmentation, of which I've written a lot about. Many sectors, the automation has resulted in a huge increase in employment. If you take banking, where automation has been really developed, everybody thought that automation in the banking sector would lead to, you know, complete removal of a lot of workers. In actual fact, if you look at the data for the United States, for example, it's led to a huge increase in the number of people working in the banking industry. Huge. Hundreds of thousands extra. But they're mainly in the precariat thing. Same in the legal professions. You see huge increase in the number of paralegals. And a lot of the jobs, a lot of the taskers and so on, are in developing countries. Many of the service things that have been affected by technological change have resulted in a growth of a precariat in Bangalore or Manila or in Accra and so on. And these are people who are really in the precariat, and they're dragging down the wages, not just in those countries, but in the industrialized countries as well. So in my view, looking at the automation issue as merely robots replacing people, it is to play the game that they would like us to play. Okay? Really what it's doing is affecting the distribution system, the bargaining capacities, and the old model of labourism. Okay? Many of those people who are working in those sort of things are not counted as workers. I mean, Karl has just mentioned South Africa. I've long contested, as you may know, I've written a whole bloody book on contesting those unemployment statistics. They're rubbish. They're not worth the thing. Because many of the women who are doing activities, and they're doing activities, they're working, believe it or not, they don't get counted. Okay? They're called unemployed. But they're not unemployed. Go and find them. They're working bloody hard. So we have a statistical problem that corresponds also to the way we understand the labour process. Many of the people who are competing in the precariat are not counted as anything. And then you've got all the 0-hour contracts, which are again manipulated by the technologies, the apps, and so on. So I think that the nuanced view of what's happening in the labour process plays to our hands, because you can't provide any security by the old social security systems. And you have to think of an alternative. Guess what you have to think of?
Okay? A last intervention?
I just want to add to that, I think I'm actually not surprised, Paul, with that, what is it, shark or snake? Jaws of the snake. Because I think from the mid-80s or early 90s onwards, the business models have been trying to do exactly that. On the one hand, very selectively also adopting technology and also globalizing labor, dispersing production, across, yeah.
Jaws of the snake. Like Korea, they get jaws of the crocodile.
Yeah. So, so even in India, for example, you take the sunset industries, the regular old factory industries, they're all going down, and they're getting automated. But then all the sunrise industries, most of them are in the informal sector, like the catering, healthcare, supermarkets, courier boys, and Uber drivers. All of them, there's no resemblance at all to the old kind of employment contract at all. So I think if you see the latest McKinsey report last year, what they are saying is that the job losses would depend on the capacity of the country, of the nation, to adopt technology. So I think what I have gathered from that report is that the job losses are going to be much more in the wealthy countries where the wages are very high than countries like India or Thailand or Philippines, because there are so many rural workers eager to get into the urban jobs, even if they are very precarious.
Jolly good. James, what would your next book be about? Just to end, so we have.
It's actually completely different. It's about, well, not completely different actually. It's about like toxic masculinity and the manosphere. So it's completely different. Though there is one, it's related in one way to what I did before. It's deeply personal.
Toxic masculinity.
So the previous book, lots of areas I went in around the country were there were lots of typically older men and younger men who did the new jobs who had this sense of identity crisis, where work at one point had provided this identity, and they didn't really feel like how they belonged to the modern world in terms of work. So there was no dignity or self-respect in many of the new jobs. You didn't derive any pride from that, and that created a lot of anger and resentment. And that led me on to the idea of the importance of having a kind of empowering identity. And then that led me down this kind of rabbit hole of all this stuff for Jordan Peterson and all these people on the intellectual dark web and all this stuff. And I just find that kind of, this book was, my last book was heavily around economics and how that affects people's lives. And this is kind of more about the cultural kind of side of that, the idea of having an empowering identity or a disempowering identity, and how this can lead people down this negative road. Anyway, I'm going on a tangent. I can go on about this for ages.
We'll buy the book when
when it's translated.
So, Becca, after all this, optimist, pessimist, where are you?
Okay, I found it a really interesting discussion. I lean slightly towards optimist by nature. I've got this tattoo on my arm to remind me of that. Otherwise, we wouldn't get out of bed and try anything, you know. So, I don't know. I feel like a lot of bad things are coming all of our way pretty soon, for a lot of different reasons.
Optimism.
Yeah.
I'm talking about Brexit at all. I'm not even, to be honest, I'm personally not even thinking about Brexit. The fact that I'm here this weekend shows I'm a slight optimist, and the fact that I do the job I do shows I'm a slight optimist. I'm not an expert.
Karl, Qatar, I mean, these Gulf states are basically, to a certain extent, slave states, in the sense that they have imported labor, living under atrocious conditions. So, any discussions down there on automation, liberation, whatever?
Automation, no, is not a big issue. Slavery is. If I suddenly disappear, if you could all call, if you could all call your local media, then it would probably be related to something like this. But I'm unlikely to disappear because I have the Georgetown name behind me. You can't make me disappear. It's a rentier society, and one of the few rentier societies that is rentier basically on the side of the entire citizenship. Unlike Saudi, where they have lots of rentier income going to the state, but still have indigenous poverty. There are basically no poor coveries. It depends on how you count, who you count to be a coverie. But rather than then be the new Luxembourg or the new Norway with very low rates of poverty, they decided to import the poorest people in the world to do most of the work for them. So between the Western professionals and the developed world, what they call migrant labor, the non-citizens outnumber the citizens about 8-to-1, and the worst off of them are subject to physical brutality and even rape with very little recourse from their employer. And that is something that me and a few of my colleagues are trying to work against and trying to get Georgetown to work harder against. Georgetown has over 100 unfree laborers providing services directly to it, with the caveat that, well, they don't work for us, they work for these other companies that are hired by the same company that hires us, not our fault. And we don't want to disrupt anything that might cause those employers to retaliate against these employees. So you should really just be quiet if you know it's good for those laborers. That's Georgetown's position. And we're doing very much behind the scenes.
As they all are. As
Yeah.
they all are. Yes.
So no, it's a sad position, but it is also it is one where they're not worried they're not concerned too much about getting the latest automation because they can get such cheap labor.
Good.
That's one reason why we need expensive labor, is to give people an incentive to automate.
Which is exactly what I was going to say.
Once again, that's quite a good punchline.
Let's not forget, if we did have a basic income, that would give more incentive to automation. The power of saying no to all of these routine tasks, etc., 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 people stop doing them, there's more incentive for those jobs to be automated. I mean, we had somebody at our conference, World Basic Income Conference, who was actually tracking which jobs were going to get automated, because it was the rates per hour gave the incentive. Let's automate that job. Let's automate that job. And so it went on. That was in the United States. So yeah, basic income, more automation.
That's a good way of ending. It's going to be an interesting exchange of ideas, and lunch is waiting for us downstairs. Thank you.